Hi. Yeah, I thought I'd just say a few words about how the book came to be written. And I think I've reached a stage in my life where I'm not doing gnarly expeditions anymore. It's sort of a little bit too much for me. So you get to, I think quite a few people get to that stage sooner or later and decide they want to put something back into an activity which has been, certainly for me, much more than a hobby, more like a way of life. And I've had this book on the go for several years now, and one of the spurs to complete it was the death of Jeremy Whitehead, because he was quite a mentor for many of us, I think, who first started getting involved in ski mountaineering expeditions. And he had a sort of knowledge and the sort of range of tips that he could pass on, which were remarkable. And then I moved on to getting involved in trying to share this in ways like seminars at Plas Brenin. So I'll just start sharing screen here just to help explain all that. So the first book I wrote, 4,000 meters, was about alpinism. Ken Wilson had been talking to people who had managed to complete the list of the column list of 52 4,000 meter peaks, and he talked to me and Colin Beachy and a few others about how it was a long time since a book had been written about that. So we got to work on that, and then by the time I'd finished it, Ken was no longer able to publish it owing to ill health. So I found a publisher in Keith Whittles in Scotland who did a very good job of it and has gone on to kindly look at the Expedition Handbook and see that it has some potential for long-term sales. It's never going to be a bestseller because people don't go on that many expeditions, or rather not that many people go on expeditions. So, but he had a belief in the book, and so we put it together as a publication now, and it should be in the shops at the moment. I haven't personally had a copy of the book myself to wave in my hand, so that gives you some idea of the delays that there have been with publication. It's all sort of supply chain problems and prices going up and things like that. So yeah, the 4,000 meter book was an opportunity to research alpinism and some of the things, like this is a skiing audience, so about how skiing came from Norway to the Alps. And there's a chapter on that in the book, and other chapters on how huts developed, guiding, those sort of things. So yeah, when it came to the Expedition Handbook, again, I wanted to research how expeditions have been approached by some of the classic writers like Frank Smythe and Eric Shipton and Bill Tillman. And so there's quite a few quotations from them in the book as well. But I got involved with these seminars in Plas Brenin on ski expeditions, and realized that we were just scratching the surface, basically. It was a big topic, and it just wasn't possible to deal with it in that form. So that's how the book came about. And as I say, it sort of dragged on because you're trying to get on with life and other things. But then it was a kind of spur to complete it with Jeremy's death. And of course, COVID lockdown gave a remarkable number of people remarkable opportunities to write. Okay, so to move on. Yeah, it's basically divided into two parts. The first part is an approach, which is theory and principles of what to do. So it gives you 10 chapters which are all about key issues in organising an expedition. What it is, where to go, research, preparation, team building issues, management in the field, and reporting back afterwards. Those are the main areas dealt with in more or less detail. And then you can tell people lots of things, but a lot of it is often forgotten. But I think Jesus had the right idea when he used parables. You know, stories tend to embody the principles in action or not. You know, you tend to remember horror stories as well as, you know, the good stories. So there's a mixture of those in a series of case studies in part 2, and that's the structure of the book. Okay. Then I had to think a bit more about this, because there was a fairly profligate attitude towards expeditioning at one time. There was like, oh, you know, get on a plane, fly off to Antarctica and wander about in Antarctica for 2 or 3 weeks and then fly back. And then, you know, right up until 1999, writers of mountaineering books were still debating whether or not climate change actually existed. You know, you get comments in their books about, oh, whether it is or not, we don't know, etc. Well, I don't think there's any doubt about that now. And so I wouldn't want people to be thinking that I was pushing that kind of approach. And I had to think about that in some detail before really publishing the book. So why did I go ahead then? Partly because talking to Paul Ramsden about this, just after he got his second PLA Door award, I was congratulating him on that. And he said, well, he said there were a lot of failures behind that before we did actually manage these successful expeditions, and we were just finding our way. So I figured maybe if we could offer people a framework in which they could conduct more successful expeditions, safer expeditions, then there would be fewer expeditions which actually ended in failure, and perhaps people would be more satisfied with fewer, more successful expeditions. And of course, taking on board the element of offsetting the carbon cost of those expeditions as well, which I think increasingly is so. And in the Eagle Ski Club now, we don't support expeditions that do not offset their carbon cost. So this picture is all about the guys in the tent at the bottom there. A couple of Netherlanders who had read my report on the Mount Everest Foundation website about a visit to Kyrgyzstan, and decided to go out there and explore the place themselves. And I do regularly get contacted by people who are thinking about that sort of thing in Kyrgyzstan to ask for advice. Now, in this case, I think it is a positive story in terms of its environmental effects on the area, because since we got involved in it, and it was very much an Eagle Ski Club succession of expeditions that explored the Akshirak range. Since we did that, other people have visited it, guided expeditions have gone in, and there's a nature reserve being formed just north of the gold mine that actually provides the winter access. And that has been a great benefit to the snow leopard population. The local hunters no longer hunt the snow leopards. They actually run trips for people to take photos of them and to spot them. So there are positive elements in this sort of exploration in opening up areas to sensitive tourism. Okay, that's how I reconciled the book to myself, and I hope I reconciled it to you. So where can you go? Well, there are still massive areas of mountain. This is looking out from a fairly from the top of Mount Grosvenor in the Wapta Icefields area. So this is Canada. It's not a completely, unexplored area by any means, but it really is remote. And you look out from the summit of this mountain and see all these peaks stretching off into the distance, and you realize how much is there to be explored, how much is there to be experienced. In many ways, it's thinking about what you have in your time and your team in order to decide where you go and what you do. And research is an important part of that. And this is a shot of Google Earth showing the area in Mongolia, which I was interested in visiting, the area that has the highest peak in the country, Khoitan, and is surrounded by 4,000-meter peaks, which had some exploration, but it looked as though there was potential for more. So when I looked at this, it confirmed my ideas about that. And also I was able to research with other people who've been near or into that. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But Google Earth, yeah, it's a good resource. It did match up pretty well to what we saw when we came over the rise, and there was a glacier ahead of us. But it's not 100% reliable. That has to be said. Again, in Nepal, you can get a permit for your mountain, you can get into the area, but then you've still got to find your mountain when it's sufficiently remote. And this is a slide of the Pokakan expedition, which was trying to identify which mountain was actually Pokakan. And that's Dick Isherwood with his binoculars staring at the one on the skyline there and thinking that that was probably it. But you can see we've got a fair amount of scouting to do. Okay. And another element which was really important was communications, not only between the team, within the team, with the support crew, the agents, whoever might give aid with logistics. But it's not just being able to communicate, because the internet has revolutionized that. It's also realizing that when you come to an obvious toilet block and you can't read which of the doors you should be using, that's when you realize you need some linguistic help in that country. And this was a great example in Pakistan. We spent all day trying to find where we had to get a particular permit, and we're just being shunted from one stall to another until eventually we found a police station and they told us we didn't need that permit after all. So that was fairly typical of the things that can happen. Okay, now Kathy built this as some tips about ski mountaineering, and there's expeditions, and there's all sorts of information that can be used. Some of it more life-saving than others. I'm just going to confine myself to two sort of areas tonight, because there's a huge amount that could be talked about. One is stoves, and that's where I'll start. You can see on the left a setup with hanging stove inside the tent, no wind or snow to put your stove out, quite cozy, but you've got to keep it well ventilated in order to avoid problems with carbon monoxide. That's a pretty safe setup. Titanium pot, hanging stove, very simple, keeps the pot in place so that it won't spill, and the gas hangs in what is a warmer environment than it would be stuck in the snow outside. However, I checked this out recently, and the slide on the right showing the jet boil, there's an awful lot of these stoves now with heat exchangers, and I just did a little sample range around the internet for, you know, like buyer's guide, advice on stoves, that sort of thing. And there's lots of information about individual makes, you know, how light they are, the materials, blah, 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 whether they, you know, are going to be fast or slow burners, this sort of thing. But none of them dealt with two very key factors, which are my top tips for tonight. One is that all stoves with heat exchangers release a great deal more carbon monoxide than those without. And there was no mention of that whatsoever. If you want to check that out, there's the 2012 Alpine Journal actually has an article by Paul Ramsden in there called The Silent Killer, which gives you all the science and details about why it is that these heat exchangers produce more carbon monoxide. So that's useful. The other point is that many of these stoves have piezo press ignitions, and which are fine at low altitudes, but when you get to high altitudes where the amount of oxygen in the mix is less, the piezo is much less reliable, and so it's worth always having a backup system for that. So those are the two top tips for tonight with stoves. And I'll just move on to pulks. One of the delights, this is a largely ski mountaineering audience, I believe. That's the talk is under the auspices of the Eagle Ski Club anyway. And when I began going into remote areas on ski, pulks were pretty much the only thing that we had available. And we concentrated our attention on improving the hauling mechanism and simplifying the sledges so that they could be left behind and without, you know, breaking the bank. So one of the problems with pulks is what you can see on the left, which is that they tend to not corner well when they're loaded. They're great if you've got a lot of stuff to carry and you're on fairly level rolling terrain, but if you're on steeper ground, going over steep passes, big mountains, they have their limitations and can be very frustrating. And they can actually, you know, it's possible. I've seen a pulk setup like that. Actually, somebody get the hand caught in the rope that had been spinning, and the circulation was being cut off, and it was quite a nasty moment. So I started looking at other alternatives, and Simon Gershon, who's a club member who's now no longer active with the club, but he used to experiment with different forms of towing pulks and towing bags, towing different things. So I started experimenting with that example. I started experimenting too, and came up with something a bit better. If you look on the right there, you can see the tracks. Now, the track that runs down in the rather ragged but still consistent Weddles is with a haul bag, and the other ones are not. I think that speaks for itself, really, because one's a pulk, one's a haul bag attached to a pulk hauling system, another is a haul bag on a rope, and another is a crazy carpet, which I think it was Peter had seen in action in Canada before. So they all ran into problems trying to descend this slope, whereas my experimental version of a towed haul bag with a pole actually managed to ski more or less the fall line without any difficulty. That's the actual rig in action going up. It hangs below, and that was a bamboo pole, which was great when we got off the snow at the end, because in our last campfire on the edge, on the snow line, I could burn the thing and didn't have to carry it out. But so that was an advantage, but it seemed a bit seemed wasteful somehow. So I moved to other things later. And this gives you an idea of the sort of terrain that you can manage with a haul bag that you just wouldn't be able to manage with a pulk. A pulk wouldn't be able to handle that steepness of slope. That's in Antarctica, and the team were fully on board with the haul bag with its pole to stop it wrapping around your legs, basically. It keeps it at a distance, at arm's length, if you like, or at leg's length, more than leg's length. Okay, so those were two sort of equipment issues that were considered and developed over time through a number of expeditions and a number of refinements. And that's often what you're doing, is trying things out. You assemble everything you know, you try and give yourself the best break, but in the end, you're test driving stuff and hoping it all works out, and always looking for an edge. Every good alpinist is always looking for an edge. Okay. That's three seasoned haul bag haulers set up for a trip in Mongolia. And that is, yeah, quite relaxed about what they're doing. Now, moving off that to, again, issues about managing an expedition, and issues about team building and team management in the field are key items of discussion in the book. And one of the things you need in any team is that everyone in it is a team player. And you can see here Stu Gallagher giving Mike Fletcher some help with an awkward binding issue, and it didn't have to be asked. He was there on the ball, ready to give assistance, even though he was suffering at that time from fairly a nasty bout of sciatica, which meant that shortly afterwards he turned back on that day out. So yeah, you need team players, and you need to get the team to play together. And that may mean seeing how many people you can get in a tent, in order to just make sure that people have an opportunity to communicate. I mentioned communications earlier. Well, actually in the field, it's very easy for people to get isolated in their tent team of 2 or 3. And there are times when you just need to cram everybody in and get a bit of talking going on and a bit of sharing and getting to know each other better and thinking about where they are and what they're doing. And from left to right there, we've got Mike Sharp, who was one of the partners in ALE, providing access to Antarctica. Lizzie Hawker, before she became world 100-kilometer champion 3 times. Derek Buckle, who's a stalwart of the Alpine Club and the Eagle Ski Club. Anna Seal, equally stalwart of the Eagle Ski Club, and me, who's just sort of there for the ride. So yeah, we got to we got to share and made a point of it. Okay. And finally, and I know this has been a bit of a breakneck jaunt through this pattern of principles in action, the whole business of reporting is actually quite important, because it means that people have more information to go on when they go into an area, and very often an exploration of an area opens it up to other people to follow. It certainly did in Kyrgyzstan in the Akshirak range, and there's no doubt that despite Greenland, Liverpool Land, having guided trips in the area close to Constable Point, the area further to the north had very little traffic and had a number of very interesting objectives to explore. And on the left, you know, I'm just keeping one of my journals in detail. It used to be one of the ways I made sure that I got some writing practice, and that's actually in a very comfortable location on board the Spirit of Sydney, the yacht that we chartered to get into Antarctica. Whereas on the right, the map of Liverpool Land is Howard Pollitt's brilliantly annotated map, which details the days that we spent and where we went, what we did, and giving the points that we got to. So there are different ways of recording things, which can be more or less helpful to people. And if you want to get money from the grant assistance from the Mount Everest Foundation or from the Gina Watkins Trust, you will need to provide a report on what you did afterwards. So it's really useful to have that body of information being accumulated. Okay. Right. Having sort of taken a quick run through the principles that are involved and some of the areas that need to be that are covered in the book and that need to be covered if you're going to have a successful expedition, I thought I'd just deal with the trip to Mongolia, which is the main ski item in the book. It was a trip that was stimulated by reading about a North Face team, an all-women's team, who went for about 5 or 6 weeks into this area, the highest area in Mongolia, and to try and ski these, I think it's 5 or 6 sacred summits. And the problem in Mongolia is the weather is pretty bad. So they took that length of time in order to find conditions right to be able to achieve their objective. So this is just in a square in Ulaanbaatar, where we just were killing time, taking a day out before our flight on to the other side of Mongolia and allowing our agent to sort out the arrangements in detail while we were on the ground. But it's a nice idea of how, you know, the people, you making contact with the people and you're finding strange, different things about the way that the country is organized. And the team begins to bond in sharing that. On the one hand, I mean, Ulaanbaatar 200 years ago was just a collection of yurts in the middle of a steppe. But now, as you can see on the left, there are 19th century Chinese buildings built on ancient models, and there are high-rise tower blocks, futuristic high-rise tower blocks. But there are also these little shops that sell everything from Johnny Walker to bottled water. And there is always a need for topping up last minute stuff that people want to add to their supplies. There's Iona, who was 23 at the time and hadn't been on expedition before, but was so keen that I thought she deserves a chance. Absolutely. And she definitely she fulfilled that promise tremendously. And now she works for Placer Brennan as an instructor. So she's built her life around her outdoor activities. And she was just picking up some extra water for the journey. And on the journey, we had some accidents in that we couldn't find our way. The guy who claimed to know the way very well turned out to get lost. So we had to call in on this farmstead and ask the people there. And of course, he was a bit reluctant because it's always sharing hospitality, cups of tea, biscuits, this sort of thing. And we were going to lose time, but he needed to find out where he was. And then he happened to mention just before we left that these people were eagle hunters. Would we like to see an eagle? So of course we all wanted to see an eagle. And this is the farmer with his eagle. I mean, the farming is basically pastoral. So they've got herds of sheep and goats, and they use the eagles to hunt foxes that threaten the herds. And they do that from horseback. So we had an opportunity to have a chat, get up close and personal with these eagles, and even have some of them on our fists, have one on our fist to see what it felt like. Pretty scary, I think, from the look on Howard's face in the photo I had of that. But yeah, and I thought it was fairly scary too. Anyway, yeah, make the most of your opportunities. That's one of the principles, I think, that isn't necessary in terms of making sure your expedition gets together, but is really useful in making sure you have fun. So this was the glacier that we wanted to get onto, and here it was really useful to have been able to talk to David Hamilton, who has run trips for the club and had run a trip to this area in summer for the Alpine Ski Club. And he had pointed out that the weather was so changeable that very often a weather window would open and you would get up within striking distance of a route on a mountain, and then that window would close, and you'd battle on for a while before having to pack it in and descend. So that was, he reckoned it was a mistake to have a base camp at the moraine, and suggested that it might be better to have one up on the glacier somewhere. So I decided that this non-attack here would probably give us some shelter and would also give us the opportunity to get at these peaks at the head of the glacier. This is Khoiton, the highest peak in the range, the highest peak in Mongolia, and I think it's 4,004, something like that. But yeah, it looks like it could be very interesting. And these other peaks in the background there are also 4,000 meter peaks, as is Chingiz here. So here we are setting off up to make camp in the lee of the non-attack. Okay. And this is the camp. And this is where I'll tell you a story which really demonstrates that you never know what you don't know. And I had been using a hanging stove with a heat exchanger in Antarctica for like 3 weeks. I'd used it on the way into this expedition high camp and in a tent, but only at altitudes up to about 2,000 meters, 2002 perhaps. And then when we got up to this altitude, the amount of ventilation that had been fine at lower altitudes just wasn't fine anymore. And it was first thing in the morning. The last thing I remember is eating breakfast. And the next thing I remember is looking up at Martin and thinking, what the hell is Martin doing in my tent? I don't share a tent with Martin. I share a tent with Iona. Where's Iona? And it was sort of, then it gradually, the story emerged that they had heard Iona fitting because of carbon monoxide poisoning. And she was making a noise, thrashing around, blue, foaming at the mouth. And they dragged her out of the tent. The rest of the team came over, dragged her out of the tent, gave her plenty of air, wrapped her up on the glacier, and then came back to tell me off for not doing anything about it, only to realize I was not breathing. And they didn't know how long I had not been breathing for. So I pieced this together afterwards. Apparently, they had to give me artificial respiration for 20 minutes before I was able to breathe unassisted. And it was a good job. They didn't also give me CPR because I understand that had they done so, my heart, which was racing, looking for the oxygen, would probably have stopped. And that would probably be an end of story. Anyway, they got me out. They gave artificial respiration, came round. Unfortunately, we had a satellite phone, so that I think it was Derek phoned up the medics at the I think it was the Austrian Alpine Club emergency line, and got some advice about it, which consisted of, have you got oxygen? Well, we haven't got any bottled oxygen, no. Well, then there's not much you can do but give them plenty of fresh air. So we did. That's what happened. I was luckier in that I wasn't sick as Iona was, although it was pretty hard not to at times. And that was that day spent recovering. So, like I say, these things can creep up on you. You can get negative reinforcement, about, the heuristic trap. You've done that before, so it's okay. You do it in slightly different circumstances and it's not okay. And it's always helpful to have as much information as you can and to keep people in touch with each other. Now, having said that, I've tried to publicize this as much as possible, and I'm doing so again. Sorry if I'm laboring the point, but I think if you read Paul's article in the Alpine Journal, he did that research at the request of the British Antarctic Survey, because even at, you know, little above sea level, no more than 1,000 meters they're camping at, even then they get casualties with carbon monoxide poisoning every year. So it's something that needs to be much more widely publicized, I think. Anyway, back to the story. So what did we do then? Well, we didn't pack up and go home. The following day, we actually felt, Iona and I actually felt good enough to get out and attempt a 4,000 meter peak up behind the Nunatak called Friendship Peak, because its summit is where Russian Siberia, China and Mongolia all meet. So it's a point at which they intersect, and so it's been called Friendship Peak. We arrived on the summit. You can see that's Iona in a blizzard, and you can see the little stake that with the bit of tape tied around it. That is the summit marker, and that was as good as it got up there. But we were all pretty determined to ski it. You can see her skis are on the ground. Well, she was, I was, and so was Howard. And there in the slide to the right, you can see her nearly down to the others who walked, and Howard on his way, and I was going to go down last of all. So we did fairly well out of that. Although I have to say, I think Iona and I weren't the only ones having a sly look at each other to make sure that we weren't getting wobbly at times. I'm sure the others were as well. Okay. So yeah, this then, having had a successful day on, that's Friendship Peak there in the background, and this is Naramdal here, and we are on Khoitan, going up the ridge that is on the border with China. And I'm not sure that anybody's ever been up that ridge before, because we ran into a guided party who were doing the ridge further. It must have been the, yeah, it must have been to the West Ridge, I think, that they were climbing, which is much closer to the Moraine base camp, which is why I think they opted for that. But from our camp, this one made far more sense and was skiable, whereas the other one was much more of a ridge climb, up and down. So the reason we are carrying our skis, though, is that there was ice underneath the snow, which meant that in ascent, we found that we were just sliding away because we weren't able to use the momentum of skiing to control it. So we all ended up carrying our skis, but we were pretty determined that we were going to ski down. And as I say, that looking out, you could see lots of possibilities over in China and in Russia, but we didn't have a permit. This is actually taken from the summit, looking at the last few meters of ascent of the second party. Yeah, really nice weather at that point. And then, keeping well away from this area of drops, we skied down. Lovely snow, but there was a sense in which every turn slid away because of the ice underneath. So it was really interesting skiing. And you can see our tracks coming from the summit down here. Now, and over to up this ridge to the summit of the third of the sacred summits that we planned to climb. And back in camp, just in case you thought all that lovely weather was continuous, it wasn't. Those were the weather windows that opened and gave us our opportunities. But this is back in camp, probably the same day in which there was a real hoolie blowing. And you can see that if you tried to have a stove outside there, you wouldn't stand much chance of keeping it alight. So now, so we did those peaks and another one, and then we realized that this peak, this major peak, Genghis, which was one of the main targets, was not going to be skiable and was probably not going to be climbable with the equipment that we'd got, although that turned out not to be entirely accurate. So the reason being that instead of having good snow, which, although it might be steep, would be skiable, there was all this ice. We'd already experienced on Khoisan that ice. So conditions, we were not what other people had, what the North Face team had experienced, or at least not for the time that they were there. We were only there for, I think, 2 weeks, so we had to get on with it if we were going to get these mountains done. And clearly, whereas I had thought in the planning stage to be able to skin up this to a point here where you could depot skis or carry them to the summit and then either ski down from there or ski down here or out, there were opportunities to look for lines. In fact, there was so much ice on it that we weren't going to be able to ski it. So we had a team meeting and decided that instead of trying to do these holy summits, we would just go peak bagging and go for as many of these 4,000 meter peaks in the area that we could get. And I think that was a sound, decision. It wasn't a contingency plan that we'd had, but it was a contingency plan that developed basically in response to the circumstances. And that's another big point about expeditioning, making the most of the situation, getting stuff done which might not be exactly what you planned, but is certainly well worth doing. So that was one of these peaks that there was certainly no record of a ski descent. And I talked to Lindsay Griffin about it because he went into that area. It was one of the earliest expeditions to go into that area at all. He had a very nasty accident there, but he reckoned that they climbed pretty much everything that was there. But of course they were there in summer, everything that looked doable. But it certainly hadn't been, we didn't think that it had been done in winter or on ski. So, and it was a lovely peak. It was really quality climbing. This was the ridge going up to the summit, and that's where we put a ski depot and then climbed up here along the ridge to the summit and got some cracking views of the rest of the range. The ice was still a problem. We went, even though we picked, other peaks that we thought were much more doable. And on most occasions, we ended up having to climb on foot to the summit from a point at which it was no longer possible to skin any longer. But we had, we'd equipped ourselves with mountaineering gear that was up to the job. You can see that Derek has got steel crampons and ice axe he wasn't going lightweight here, because, you know, that might mean he wasn't going to get up it. And for Derek to have equipment let him down to go up was absolutely unacceptable as far as he's concerned. So there he was, and others. Off we went. And this was one which I think Lindsay said was called the Shepherd. And that's John Kentish and Iona on another part of that ascent. In the background there is another peak that we climbed on ski, although we did have a few skatey moments on this ice near the top. And this one didn't seem too impressive, really. I think it was probably a shade under 4,000 meters. But when we saw this couloir dropping down here, it became a lot more attractive. So off we went to climb this ridge to the summit. And then after a bit of a sketchy descent through this these rocky bands, got into this couloir and skied back down. Not all of us, I think it was just a keen team, but everybody enjoyed the mountaineering. Here we are, just getting up onto the summit of that one. And here's Iona skiing the couloir steeply nearer the top and easing a little near the bottom. Absolutely wonderful skiing. It was, you know, typical steep skiing, if a bit heavy. The snow was a bit heavy, but that was probably a first ski descent, I would think. Not that we're counting. And then, having climbed pretty much everything that we could reach from that camp, we got the exploration bit firmly between our teeth, and went on to move down to another arm of the glacier, which we intended to explore. And there again, we made a discovery that was new to us all, which was that these bags that we were using, those were all of one make, but Iona was using a bag of a different make that had got a texturized outside material, which appeared to be tougher, but in fact, when she was skiing down, even though, you know, she's a pretty fast skier, she was getting left behind all the time because of the additional drag of her haul bag. So that was something which none of us had anticipated, and I think she's probably replaced that with something a bit speedier now. Okay, so down the glacier we went, put up a new camp here, again in a shelter of some moraine, with a peak rising up to the left against the north winds. And this is the moraine beyond which the traditional yurt camp would have been put by David's team, who came in the summer. But we headed up this glacier arm to explore further. Found some great scenery. That's a peak called Snow Church. And I did have some ideas about skinning up as far as possible and then climbing a ridge or getting up here. That would be too long, but who knows? You know, there's you can get up some remarkably steep stuff if you put enough turns in. Anyway, with that amount of ice on it, it wasn't going to be doable. But around the corner here, we did find a really good 4,000er in rather doubtful conditions. The weather was looking a bit dodgy, but this is on the summit. We found an easy way up around a spur, and then decided to ski the steep face down back to the glacier. And that's a couple of shots on the face. So steep, in fact, that it took, I remember I was ahead and realized that I was just above a Bergschrund basically, and had to make some pretty rapid calculations for where to jump it. But it was fine. It was all manageable, doable. And I think that's John on the left, higher up, and Howard on the right, ripping it up in his own inimitable style. Okay. So this was Chingiz over here. And we ran out of time, basically. There was opportunities to get around here. There was a pass between these mountains here, which could have led into another area to explore, but we didn't really have the time to do it. And so, having explored this area now fairly thoroughly, we decided that we would go back to our rendezvous with the camels that were going to take our kit out. But on the very last day, Howard and Derek decided to have a go at climbing this couloir here to the summit of Chingiz. Not a ski ascent or descent, but it did look a bit messy in places, rocks and snow. But you know, they did get to the summit, full marks, and they found the summit was completely wind-free. Whereas what had put off most of us going with them was the fact that it'd been blowing a hoolie down on the glacier. So it just shows that you can never be 100% confident in your predictions about what the weather's doing at different heights on different mountains. Anyway, that was getting back across the glacier towards the moraine camp. And the camels had turned up. The drovers made a point, got them loaded up pretty thoroughly. And off we went. And you can see there, this area has got horrible access from this direction, but by going up that glacier arm that we'd been exploring, it would have been possible to get over into it more further to the southwest. And so it's possible. There's other stuff in there. And I think that's one of the things about going on expeditions is you always try and have a look around at what else might be possible, because you might decide to come back. I mean, I went back 4 times to the Akshiraq range. I went to the Akshiraq range and then went back 3 times and explored new stuff every time. And in this range, yeah, there are other possibilities. And certainly the guided expedition that we saw doing the long, let me go back. No, this long ridge on Khoitan was the one they came up and had to carry skis pretty much the whole way. And that the guides had been there before, but they never skied this that we came down until, you know, we recommended it to them to go. So, and they had never, you know, on previous trips to the area, they'd never skied some of these mountains that 4,000ers that we skied as well. So maybe going through this pass into that area would yield, you know, unclimbed objectives, at least in winter. Okay. So that was it. There's Iona, a great survivor, and I really hope that she appreciated that how lucky we were in doing so, because it was a very close thing, and it's part of the problem with going into new areas, doing new things, is that you can't know everything about them. All you do is try to stack the odds as favorably as you can in your favor. And on the cover is a very great friend of mine, Yvonne Holland, who died a couple of years ago, who had been one of the fittest women I've ever known, who had been on stacks of expeditions. She died of cancer, and I think I was very glad that I was able to put that photo of her on Denali on the cover of this. It's a kind of way of remembering her. Now, right. Yeah, another guy on the right there, Dick Isherwood. He's another guy who hasn't made it. He, I've been on several expeditions to China with him, and he survived all the expeditions, but then died of internal hemorrhage back home. And there he is on a on retreat from an attempt on Hazy Shan. He and Jeff Cohen had got to the highest point at that time on Hazy Shan, and we were trying to build on their experience after being after finding that the other mountain that we'd originally gone to climb became off limits. And the reason I put this up is that something strange, something unusual happened when I was going back to the journals that I'd written on expedition for the details to write up the case studies. And I found that there were quite a surprising number of poems that I'd written in the backs of these journals, and that I'd forgotten were there and had never done anything with. And so I decided to try and do something with them, because the Expedition Handbook is very practical, schematic sort of way of writing about expeditions, but it's not the whole story. The whole story involves quite a lot of detail about how people traveling in a place which is has a different culture, a different society, different landscape, how they relate to that, and how they relate to the people who live there too, and how those people relate to you. And so I think I became aware that we do need to write about expeditioning, we do need to write about mountaineering and ski mountaineering in ways which are more complete, if you like, in ways which actually allow us to write about our vulnerability, our sensitivity, and not just decline into what Alvarez called not literature, you know, because it wasn't exploring the human condition, it was just falling into the macho stereotypes that were kind of expected from the genre. He gave a lecture to a mountain literature festival where basically he said, the problem with mountain literature is most of it isn't literature. It's just written to fund the next expedition. Well, I'm not guilty of that, because there ain't going to be another expedition as far as I can see. But the poems were an interesting thing to work through your feelings and memories in a different way. And just to close this now, I'd like to just read one short poem from that collection. If you're interested in following this up, the Expedition Handbook is available on Amazon and from Whittles Publishing as part of a full-blown marketing enterprise that Whittles have undergone. But the way taken, the poem collection of poems, is only available from me. And I'll post one out to you if you want it. You can get in touch with me by email. But this poem is called Stormbound, and I think it's one of the enduring memories of expeditioning is bad weather, stormbound. The whispering of snow against the tent becomes a more insistent pattering, and distant rumbles of squall draw closer like a spindrift avalanche. Tent fabric beats like a drum, poles thrum, a loose guide panel flaps. Who knows how long before the whispering resumes? We curl deeper into sleeping bags, fill pee bottles, loath to leave the down cocoons keeping us alive, listening to the sounds of another world, a filament of nylon away. Coming here as load bearers, we hope to leave as climbers, perhaps summiteers. Thanks. We all, I think, have that hope when we go on these expeditions, but it's not always recognized, not always achieved. So thanks very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, and any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. As you say, a dip into a vast topic, but although I've not seen the book, I do know that your use of the case studies draws out a lot of the detail in a very, a very sort of readable way.
Thanks.
So looking forward to my copy. Quick question from me. What are your go-to resources when you're at the stage of thinking of an expedition? And you've mentioned various people and hearing stories, but what are your go-to resources?
Well, I talked at the beginning about how it's a bit of a way of life, basically, and you find yourself looking for details that can trigger the idea of going somewhere. I mean, I was very lucky because I didn't have a regular about, but I used to read the reports in the Alpine Journal and the very comprehensive reports in the American Alpine Journal, who their editors are very good at tracking people down. And I used to get requests after doing stuff. You know, I hadn't been in touch with them, but they got to hear of what I've been up to and asked for reports to go into the American Alpine Journal. So that is probably the most thorough and complete kind of collection of information on up-to-date stuff. The Alpine Journal also has an area notes sections on different areas. And of course, if you are limited to only being able to take, say, a long holiday in the summer, you're limited as to the areas you can go to. Alaska is out for a start off, and you know, you're looking at maybe areas like the Garwal or Kyrgyzstan or Peru. So that tends to shape what you can go for. But so there is not, what I'm trying to say is there's no one go-to resource. There's quite a lot of them out there. And, you know, just living that sort of life where you're reading up on things, you're always, you know, sort of tuned in to think to even like going to huts in Spain or the Alps, where you find copies of magazines with interesting sort of locations that people have been to. You're always sort of looking for suggestions, really, that chime with your interests. But certainly, yeah, the American Alpine Journal, I would think, is one of the best sources of stuff. And people often do say, you know, they go in the summer, they climb stuff there, and then they might say, this looks like it's got potential for a winter visit on ski. And so that's when your antennae really pick up on that and try and follow it through. So, is that helpful?
Cheers, Dave. No, thank you. Let me throw it open. Does anybody else have any questions? If you like, you can just unmute yourself if anybody else has any questions. Otherwise,
sorry. Hi, Dave. It's Anna Seal.
Oh, Anna.
Hi. Great talk. Really enjoyed it. So you said there are no more expeditions. If you could go on another expedition, where would you go to?
Well, that's a very good question. A very good question. I started to shape the sort of places that I would be prepared to go from my present sort of condition with having a bit of a back problem. And so load carrying in any major sense is pretty much out for me. The most I've been able to carry since the back problem developed is the sort of pack you would take on the Wafter ice fields, where you would be carrying food and glacier rescue equipment, but not be carrying tents. I mean, you'd probably be carrying a fair quota of warm clothing because conditions can get quite extreme in the Wafter, but you wouldn't be having that tent to haul. So the last one I looked at seriously was Kamchatka, because I thought that it would be possible to get a base camp, to fly into a base camp and then do ascents of mountains around it using just an assault tent and a fairly lightweight, 2-3 day pack, rather than having, say, a week or two supplies to haul around. And that quite appealed, but I'm afraid it's an area of still active volcanicity, and that the particular volcanoes that I was interested in obstinately refused to stop erupting. So that was just out for me there, and they've continued to be a bit dodgy. I mean, the volcanicity is a real issue. I mean, I've climbed Villarrica in Chile on ski, and when Kathy and I were out there in Chile and Argentina climbing volcanoes, which were supposed to be dormant, Villarrica really blew its top, and it was amazing to see how much volcanic debris was being spouted out of a peak that you're trodden on in the snow, sort of thing. So there are issues, yeah. But on the other hand, I'd like to go somewhere that's not too far as well. I think these mega long haul trips are getting increasingly difficult to justify, and Greenland was one of my last trips, and that was a trip well worth doing. I think, Declan, you might want to comment on that because you were there.
Yeah, no, fantastic trip.
Yeah, it was a great trip. It was quite expensive, but I think everywhere's getting expensive now, and it has its own logistic problems, but it doesn't involve the sort of enormous sort of air miles sort of carbon cost that somewhere like Antarctica or New Zealand, say, or which is not a particularly expeditionary environment, but it is, some areas of that are pretty remote in their way. Yeah, it's a difficult one. If I didn't have the back problem, it would be lovely. I'd like to go I arranged to go to Tibet, and then they closed Tibet so that I wasn't able to explore that glacier. And I've never had the opportunity to mount another expedition there. So that's unfortunate. And there's plenty to do in Alaska. That again, as soon as it comes down to 2 or 3 weeks of, you know, load carrying, moving around, I've got a problem there. So I think that's kind of led me to think I've got to cut my coat according to my cloth these days, and do things. You know, we made some really interesting descents in the ascents and descents in the Pyrenees, which very rarely done. I've done a first ascent in the Pyrenees that I hadn't realised was a first ascent until everybody came up to me and shook my hand in the hut afterwards. So you know, there are possibilities of doing interesting stuff. It doesn't have to be at the ends of the earth, and so I'd encourage people to think more across the board, really, about what they're doing. Is that okay, Anna?
Yes, thank you. That was thank you. There's so many places to go, aren't there, and so many things to do.
Yeah, there are. Yeah.